Human culture thrives when discussions about what is true, what is just, and what is beautiful is remembered as an ongoing, never-ending, never-complete conversation.
To quote Milton, by the known rules of ancient liberty, welcome to Risky Conversations. I am your co-host, Ember Sadat. Join me and my co-host, Ace Deliri, as we engage in this ancient tradition of discussions around interesting topics with utterly fascinating people.
Hi, James. Welcome to Risky Conversations. Please introduce yourself to our audience and we can get started.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and it's a really nice, honorable. I feel great to be on the show, and I just turned 40. I've been trading for 16 years, roughly. I trade options now full time. I used to trade futures, and that got kind of harder and harder with the rise of electronic trading. And I kind of got into the business because my dad, he was a member of the Chicago Board of Trade for, he's still a member now, but he started there in the late 70s. And that's how I kind of got into the business. But from the university standpoint, I didn't really go to school for trading or finance or anything. So I was kind of not using what I learned at school.
Okay, no worries. So what did you go to school for?
I was just a liberal arts major. I went to school called Villanova in Philadelphia, and I just studied history and political science. So I don't have a technical background at all, but I'm trying to get a little more, trying to improve that a little bit in my free time. So
no worries. So for those of us who don't know, what exactly is the Chicago Board of Trade, and what exactly is
the Chicago? Okay, so New York was always sort of known for stocks, the New York Exchange and stuff like that. But then I believe, in the 70s is sort of when the government and these contracts, derivative contracts, futures came around. And so the Chicago exchanges, which specialize in futures, they kind of took off more. And, they have a lot of contracts for agricultural stuff. And then, the big one, of course, was bond trading because the market is just so massive. So once you introduced treasury bonds into the system, it just kind of exploded. And then I think in the 90s, when the S&P futures contract really took off, especially when we had a big bull market, in the 90s around the world, especially tech stocks, and that kind of flourished then too. So I think it sort of took, a lot of the bigger speculators in the world, they were never really stock traders or currency traders, or they're, futures traders. That would be like George Soros or Paul Tudor Jones or any of those big names. So they were always kind of doing business at the Chicago exchanges, CME or the Chicago Board of Trade, and they've merged now. So
okay. Okay. So for our listeners, what is the difference between a future and an option?
Well, it's a technical. An option is essentially insurance. If you want to buy insurance, to protect yourself from a rise or a fall in the price, you can do that with an option. And, they vary. The prices depend on how far away they are at the money, which is essentially like the current stock price. And it's fairly complicated stuff because there's several different components to, pricing them. And, there's the Greek, so it's like delta, theta, gamma, vega, and they all kind of work together, and that's how you kind of determine a price, and it's complicated. So anyway, that's just like the brief rundown. But think in the terms of insurance. It's like, okay, if I own Apple and Apple is $200, but I'm worried that Apple's going to decline to $180, you can go online and say, okay, I can buy a put for $4 or something, and at the price of $180. So you pay a premium, which is $4 for it. And if the market, if it goes down and it goes down without a lot of time passing, then you should make money and protect yourself against, a price decline.
Okay, perfect. All right. So, what made you switch from trading futures to switching to options? Like, what was your, besides the computer because you stated that it was the algorithms and the computers trading and whatnot.
Right.
But I imagine they're in both markets, are they not? Or did they leave one side alone?
They are. It's just gotten more difficult. And to be honest, too, I've got more interested in options, especially from learning a lot of Nassim's work. And I've really been interested like in the tail, which is a complicated thing, but it's essentially like you're making a bet with something called the fourth moment, which is the kurtosis of a distribution. And it's sort of, if you draw a probability distribution, you can, a lot of them, they would look like a bell curve, but, in the stocks, they don't quite look like that. The reality is they have a tail that can go on for miles. So these options, they're way out of the money, and you kind of buy them and you kind of hope for a very big move. And these happen pretty rarely, but not as rarely as a lot of the models say they would have. So that's kind of what I've been interested in. But it's the learning curve has been kind of steep, and while I understand, I think 80% of it, I think some small parts of it I've still kind of learned, and so that's been something I've really been interested in. So.
Okay. So for our listeners, again, one of the things that we really focused on with regards to this Risky Conversation series is we really want them to learn and to have an idea of what it is people are talking about. So would you mind going into the concept of what is kurtosis, what are these first moment, second moment, third moment concepts? Because they hear these terms and they have no idea what they're referencing. So for somebody who's involved in it, please elaborate.
So if you build a distribution, there's, the mean, the standard deviation, the skew, and the kurtosis. So these are the four components that would make up like a probability distribution. And so essentially you're taking a bunch of values, you're trying to establish a mean, and then you're trying to establish a distribution. And then a skew is something, is essentially like how far, trying to determine how far the market might be. Well, it's essentially looking at distribution and saying it's not a bell curve. Like there's one side of it has a lot more room than the other. And then the kurtosis is sort of maps in with that too, where you're trying to say how much of the contribution, away from the mean is coming from these tails. Like the tails explain much more of the distribution than the average mean. So it's technical stuff, but that's and so if you think about it in probability or like in statistics, a lot of times like we don't really know the true distribution. So it's like we're estimating them. So it's like in statistics say you have a population, but we don't really have a population in these things. We sort of have a sample size. So we're trying to samples and say, okay, well, the stock moves, its 20-day volatility is 2%. And then you try and extrapolate and say, well, okay, what are the odds or probability that, loses 50% or something? We don't really know how to do that. You know what I mean? Because we don't really have enough data, but we just try and estimate that. So that's and that's pretty standard, I think, with all statistics, where you don't really ever know the true population. You just use some stuff to estimate it and you try and go from there.
Okay, perfect. So I just wanted to follow up with this on a few fronts. So for me, I don't play in these areas. So I'm just an outside observer, just pointing out some things. The way I see it is as follows, and tell me if I'm wrong, because what it is the people who are engaged in a specific business. There are other people watching this and saying, I'm going to make a market for this business to predict whether it's going to go up or down. For example, oil, right? Everybody understands the price of oil because the price of gas reflects in everybody's dollar. So we can all see it. Whenever we hear on the news that, oil prices have gone up to $10 a barrel more, we all know, oh my God, my price of gas next week is going to be crazy. So in a way, we're trying to relay the information from that level, bringing it down to the average person. But so here's where I'm trying to get a real grasp of some of the nitty-gritty details of it. So people like yourselves and people who are engaged in trying to look at things from a fat tail distribution, i.e. there's almost infinite variance because the tail just keeps going, and you can have 15 standard deviation, 6 standard deviation, whatever can happen at the end is there, right? But you can't price something like that if you're selling it. So you have to assume it's normally distributed, so you can actually price it to the point where you can say, okay, I can price this because I see that this can be something that I can package You come along and you look at that and you go, this model is incorrect for this particular commodity, whether it be, a stock or whatnot. And because it's incorrectly priced, I can benefit off of it from profiting because I know that this is incorrectly done. But if they were to price it correctly, they would never be able to do that because it's infinite in terms of its variance, correct?
Right. So, yeah, I mean, and that's the thing is like you see from like the model like Black-Scholes, I think it's sort of telling you that like options around the money are kind of overpriced, and then you get into the tails and no one knows exactly how to price them. So obviously if you are selling them, you got to be really, really careful. And I'm sure, we see over time that, firms obviously, do that. But then like one day if you have a big move, a bunch of them just go bankrupt, almost overnight. And I think we've had that. I remember when the Swiss franc had a really big move a couple years ago, and then all of a sudden there's all these stories about some brokerages just going belly up, and they were probably on the other side of it, and they, literally would have disappeared that day. So, because they were just, the amount, they would have lost, maybe 10, 20,000. I don't even know, more than that of their whatever they're doing selling. So it's a huge amount of money. Huge.
All right. So why do you think these banks take a risk if it's known that they can go bankrupt?
Well, I'm sure some of them don't know that they can go bankrupt and they do it anyway. And also, and this is a good thing to talk about anyway, is that, there's a lot of agency problems in, the world too, and especially in banking, which has the worst agency problem where it's just, essentially you're being backed by a taxpayer. And the government is just, hell bent on never letting a bank fall into some sort of bankruptcy because, they're so worried it's going to, blow up the system. So what they do is they really are in the business of sort of betting against low probability events. And, it pays to do that because we don't have a lot of crises very often. Crises are pretty rare. So, maybe every 10, 15 years we have something really, really bad. But that's enough if you're in that business to say, if I'm a man, making a lot of money, they just say, well, hey, I can get out of here if I've made $5 million, I'm going to retire and I stuff all these risks to the next guy, because there's no recourse or really clawing anybody's money back. At least, there may be some a little bit more now, but, there certainly wasn't 10 years ago we had a financial crisis. Everybody just kind of left. So you remember when, I don't know if you ever read about when Nassim would talk about how there was, the Bob Rubin trade where it was like Bob Rubin made $100 million from Citibank, while he was there, retired, and the bank went bankrupt. And then, he didn't have any, no one called him for any money back. You know what I mean? So,
right.
It's a pretty good deal. And you just call up the government, and the government says, oh, no problem. We'll be happy to donate, trillions of dollars worth of taxpayer money towards any bank. So that's just it's an insidious, it's a really bad system. And, we haven't really we've done some stuff to maybe mitigate some of these problems, I would imagine. But I still think there's probably a lot of this moral hazard kind of play where, I'm going to take the upside and then somebody else takes the downside. So that's it.
Right.
So is this like partying on the Titanic and leaving before it crashes?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's exactly right. You're like, and we also, yes, I think that's exactly correct. And it's like we even see this, I think, at the political level too, or not the political level, in politics where, politicians are sort of incentivized to spend, other people's money and future generations' money, and they're just not, accountable. I live in Chicago, and, the fiscal situation here is just horrendous, and it's obviously been created by a system, decades of politicians just, promising more and more future, tax dollars to, get reelected, and then they stick around for maybe 10 years, but the legacy of their policies, the amount of money that's owed is just constantly being piled up to the future. And so now we're in a situation here where, we've had a bad situation, but as far as, we can see, it looks to me like the next couple of decades, if you're in Illinois and especially Chicago, it's like you're going to be taxed literally forever at a pace that, people have not seen, I think, in a long time or ever, really, really, high rates or stuff. It's just, they're looking for taxes on anything. So
right.
It's a major problem, and it's growing every day too.
So what's interesting about that is I tried to look at the market in a particular way. That's like, imagine if the market is closed, right? So if it's a closed loop system, the taxpayer who gives haircuts and does some plumbing work, he works and he gets taxed. That money goes to the politician who promises it to go to some union based job that's going to rebuild the bridge. The money is sort of being recycled back in, right? So in a way, the net loss of that shouldn't be too drastically high. Obviously, it's an inefficient allocation of resources, so you're going to have losses. But it's because it's sort of a closed loop system, you're more likely to see at least some of the benefit come back. However, given the way that the United States is and how easy it is to move funds around, what I'm starting to see, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that the misallocation of resources is almost compounded by the fact that the people who are being taxed just decide, you know what, I'm leaving. Like, for example, I just read Governor Cuomo in New York was freaking out because all the wealthy people from New York are basically just leaving. And so he's saying, I have nobody else I can tax. And if I do more taxes, I'm just going to, have no funds left over to make all these promises. So the question is, why are these ideas that it seems very common sense, right? Like if you tax people and you don't deliver value, there's nothing inherently wrong with taxing or not taxing. There's just wrong with the inefficiency of spending it, right?
Yeah, and I think one of the other things too is we're seeing with taxes and all the other and inefficient spending is that I think it maybe works better in like smaller states, you know what I mean, where stuff's just more. And like if you look at, I think the way I understand, like the Nordic states, like, Norway and Sweden and stuff, they have high tax rates. But, these are, countries that have, 10 million people, something like that. So it's so much more confined that you can probably have a much better understanding about what's going on, where the money's going, and it's easy to determine if it's being well spent. But you get into something like the U.S., or, you get into like the population is so much larger and, there's so many more confusing ways to, hide stuff. And it's just more and more difficult to determine what exactly is going on. So it's like it's a scale issue. And, it's like the same thing, I think, with Singapore, where they have a really small population too. And we kind of view it in the West as like authoritarian to a certain extent because it seems like they don't have as much freedom. But the bottom line is it's so much smaller that they can do things in a little bit different way just because it's and so it's just or it's like the Soviet Union, it's like, oh, communism, but it's like, well, maybe we could say that communism maybe works really well with like a small area, you know what I mean? But like if you were the Soviet Union or something, this just massive huge geographical place, and you just can't you can't work like that. So I think that's, important to think about how, what are the properties of stuff before you just say, oh, this or that won't work.
Yeah. You know what? I had an interesting way to sort of visualize that scale for most people, right? Because when you hear, oh, the market lost $1 trillion, to the average person, I don't even know if not the average person could really fathom what $1 trillion evaporation feels like or looks like, or when they say billions of dollars have been funded.
What?
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. So the way I was trying to explain it to people, I said, okay, imagine it this way. Right? So you're a married couple and you have energy and funds and capabilities. So you bring a child into this world and all of a sudden your energy and your funds are cut in half because now you have to devote your resources, hopefully if you're a good parent, to this child. Right. And you lose sleep and all that stuff. And so it compounds itself around you because now you're more tired, you're more, all that stuff. And then you bring a second child into it. The second child is not twice the effort. It's almost 4 times the effort. Because now that second child is going to take half of what you started with, not with what you originally had, but half of what you started with after the first child came. So on a scale aspect of it, it's you're not just twice as tired as you were when you had your first child. You're 4 times as tired because they're literally dividing up whatever little resources you have left in terms of sleep and money and attention to that much more. So in a way, people, I try to explain that to them. Like, look, when you scale things out and you say, okay, I want to give somebody something for free. Everybody deserves quote unquote free education. You start to think about that and you go, okay, well, how many people can you give that to before it's unsustainable? Right. And then so that's where that's where the scaling issue, I think where people really have a difficult time is connecting the dots between what it means to give something and what that means to give that to everybody.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you, and I do wonder if we're seeing around the West that like fertility rates have really declined dramatically over the last like 30 years, and I don't think anybody really knows the causes, but you do wonder if at some level people's just resources for the average person, middle class or lower, are maybe just sort of tapped out financially and time wise, and I don't think that maybe explains all of it. Maybe it's an issue with birth control too, where we've had more and more birth control and we're just finding, the effects of it decades later. But it's kind of it's an eerie, it's something we should probably worry about. I don't think we want to see birth rates get so low that, we're become Japan or anywhere. But, but it's just so obvious. Like I think in every place, like US and Western Europe, I don't know about Canada, but it's probably not that much different either. But, hey, it's like our people just, they're, if you're a younger person now too, I think all over the place, if you want to have a family, you're also contending with, you owe a lot of money for student loans, and that's a real crimp on your lifestyle. And if you want a child, I mean, think about it. It's just, it can be daunting, and that's life. Fortunately, we have a wonderful habit of accidentally having children too. So that's
it kind of balances it out.
Yeah. So it's like I don't know if we'll ever, that's maybe that's a good thing right now. So
well, what's interesting about that, because we discuss these issues all the time, and one of the things like we always kind of come back to is let's just look at the logic of a certain number of things that have happened, i.e. When if you go back 50, 60 years ago, or maybe even further back, women didn't work as much and they stayed at home, which meant that the labor pool was smaller. So whatever positions were available had to be paid more for. But then almost instantly you double the labor force, which means you cut wages in half, which is good for the business because now they have more people they can tap into. But that's bad for the people because what you were getting paid for job A is now cut in half, which means you do need two incomes in the household just to pay the bills and just to get the mortgage in and all the other stuff that goes with it. So in essence, what could have been like, I know a lot of folks who, I bought this house, I worked in this company when I was in the 1960s and whatnot, and I own the house. And today, it's like I know people who have two incomes and they can barely pay rent for an apartment, right? Yeah. So there are dynamics of that as well.
Yeah, and I think it's just I think what's gone on in the last 3-4 decades is like, globalization has probably been great. It's great for corporations and the super wealthy. And, we're seeing labor share like at home in their home countries really decline. It's like this one thing that Trump sort of picks up on. He's like, well, he looks at China and says, well, they've, kind of stealing our wages. And that's not really maybe an accurate way of looking at it. But, there's no doubt that, manufacturing has gone to, lower income places. And, and now some of that feeds back into all of our economies because we get cheaper stuff.
Right.
But I think that there is obviously has been a squeeze on people's incomes. And it is like you said, we seem to have people that, just the basics, I think, are really, are harder and harder to get. And you read about when you read about the 1950s, like you said, or 60s in the U.S. or all similar places, it does sort of I'm fairly familiar with the history of the period. It does sort of seem almost like a halcyon period or something, and where mom stayed at home all the time, and dad had enough money to kind of just get everything going, and and now that world is just really just gone. So it's.
Yeah. What's interesting about that aspect of it, and of course, I mean, people listening to this will have areas of disagreement, and we do want to cover some of them just because we want to look at this from multiple angles. But the thing that's interesting about that is if you increase the labor pool to double, right, and there's an employer who's looking to hire, one of the things they could do now is they could put arbitrary requirements as to what's needed to get that job, i.e., you need a degree. All of a sudden, the people who didn't go to school now have to go get a degree. But then they can move the goalposts again and say, we need a master's degree. So all of a sudden the boom in the world of academia starts to take off, because now they're able to say, hey, if you don't have a degree, you can't get a job. Because I remember when I was in high school, every single conversation with everybody I had, and they were like, Ace, you're a relatively bright kid, you do some dumb stuff, but you're still relatively smart. Make sure you get into university, right? And I didn't know any better because, I was just a kid. And that was like, there was never a single person who said, hey, figure out a way to actually, find a way to increase value for other people and then capture a slice of that for yourself, and don't get into unnecessary debt and don't do this and don't do that. But that conversation never happened. It was always, make sure you go to university. And they don't bring the conversation up about how much university costs and, oh, don't worry, there's loans for that. You can take the loans. And I'm like, okay, that's great. But you do that for 2 generations, and all of a sudden, the labor pool is now, not only is it doubled, but it's doubled with people saddled with debt with degrees that they can't really add value with. Because as soon as you show up to a company and say, hey, I have this degree in field X, they go, that's great. We need a coffee server. Go over there and fill out an application. So now the low paying job that you do have that you're supposed to start a life with is now paying back a degree that's clearly got no value in the marketplace, right? So there's a lot of vicious negative cycles that are all plugged in at various levels that are just leaching. And it's, I guess Nassim's term for this was rent seeking. There's a lot of rent seeking happening here.
Yeah, and in the student loan market too is not, it's all funded by the government, so it's not really a marketplace. It's subjected to market forces. So you could probably make the case that there was more free markets for interest rates for student loans, that probably the price of going to school or the ability to borrow would probably be at much higher rates, because just what's going on is that the return from the university or the loans that we're making for people to go to school, they're just not really paying off, and instead it's subsidized by the government. So now you have this just massively weird system where student debt's just ballooning like crazy. It's a lot of people, the right people aren't holding the risk for it, and then we're just seeing the degrees from the university just not worth anything, and there's no and the system's so stodgy where we don't even have a situation now where if you looked at the average, like say you're an engineer and or a math person or STEM person, you can kind of tell that usually you have a higher starting salary than if you were a liberal arts major. But we don't even see differences in the price of degrees. You know what I mean?
Yes.
So it hasn't, which is insane, because you're just like, how is it not even involved? Like this would be even before you got rid of like student loans. You would think that system would sort of being involved and saying, okay, well if you're going to be an English major, it's probably should be 30% less than if you're going to be a biology or something like that, because you're just not going to get the return out of school. But we can't seem to really get there until it blows up. And then at some point, I think, there'll be some sort of a blow up with student loans and I don't know, figure out another way. And that's probably that's something Silicon Valley can probably do, figure out, better and cheaper, education alternatives. And
right.
I don't know.
Well, what's interesting.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, what's interesting on that, to build up on that, is twofold, right? One, you hit the nail on the head with regards to costs, right? So why should your degree in studying English literature be the same as if you're studying math? But second of all, why is the timeline the same? Why do you need 4 years for both, right?
Yeah,
so that's a compounding effect of you're losing money because you're not working, and you're getting a loan for something. Like it's like you go to the Apple store and you say, the iPad mini and the Mac Pro are exactly the same price. It's fair if you're buying a Mac Pro, but it's a ripoff if you're buying the iPad mini, right? So in essence, the people who are buying getting the STEM degrees are in essence sort of funding the people, attracting the people who are coming in, who are, getting these degrees in fields that have no real, outside world value. And those people are essentially funding the university's administrative staff, right? Because let's be honest, you don't need 4 years to study some of these degrees that they're offering. There's nothing wrong with, there's individual people who are fantastic at every particular field, but the field itself in general,
I don't think it
generates more noise.
I wouldn't say, I'm not the kind of person that would say, oh, don't ever become an English major if that's what you want to do or anything like that.
Right.
But the price of, because, obviously not everyone wants to be a math or science But I think the other interesting thing too is like I've seen, like requirements, like you said, we were talking about more and more requirements for stuff. And, why can't, like if you went to high school and you had decent test scores, like why couldn't you just maybe go to one more year of like a prep course or something and then go to law school? I mean, I don't, what I mean? Like why would you need to attend 4 years of a university and then go to law school? By the time you're 20 years old, you're probably going to have most of the skills you need to go to law school. You can read and you write better and all that other stuff. And I don't think you can do that. And I've noticed too, when you were taking the CFA exam, which is like an exam for finance and it's a well-known one, I think there was a time where maybe you didn't even have to go to college and you could take it and get it. And I think now you have to go. But in my mind, I just think, hey, if you're smart enough to go to high school and maybe have, 1 year or something and you could pass the CFA exam, I mean, I would think you're probably fairly with it. You know what I mean?
Right.
You don't really need to go to 4 years of college to do that. And instead, it's just, like you said, you're just, tacking on more and more credentials and you're tacking on more and more exams that I think we all know exams are sort of their power, their ability to really help you on a day-to-day basis in a job. Becomes very limited very fast, for most people. You just, the real world is the real world, and the world of exams is the world of exams. And they have some overlapping, but you take an exam and you study for months for it or something, or a credential, and then maybe you get a job because of it. But then 6 months later, you realize 95% of what you learned you're not using and you don't remember, and that's it.
Yeah. No, what's interesting about that, and here's where I tie into that in regards to, I think one of the aspects they try to use with regards to quote unquote taking more classes is they wanted to use time as a filter. So they say, oh, you know what, you're not really cut out for this job or whatever. But the thing is, it's like, well, we want people to fail fast. We don't want them to fail slow, because then you could discover what they're good at a lot quicker. And so one of the things that I would recommend in that particular instance is, like, when I teach people how to code, and I always do that, I'm like, look, you don't need to learn everything about this particular programming language. What you need to learn is what is the 20% of it that you need to know absolutely, so you could do 80% of the job in the real world. And that's what's key, right? And that gives you the leverage to know whether, hey, first of all, maybe this isn't even for you, right? Like, I know people who became lawyers and didn't want to do practice law. They're like, I went through law school, I did the bar exam, I went work for a year, and I hated it. I'm like, okay, that's a long time to learn a lesson that could have been learned instantly, where if you, like you stated, imagine you graduate high school and you decide you want to be a lawyer. So they say, okay, here's an apprenticeship program. It's 1 year long. You get to become a person who basically follows a lawyer throughout their day, and they give you some menial jobs, but while you're just on the job, quote unquote, learning, and you get to see what it's all about. You get to see all the long hours. You get to see all the stuff that you may not necessarily be exposed to. And you realize real quick, I don't want to do this, right? That's much better to filter as a mechanism than it is to go through 4 years of a degree and then whatever, I think it's 2 years for law school, and then 1 year of articling and all that. And you just say, look, how much time I could save you if we can just show you that maybe this is the life you don't really necessarily want, right?
Well, yeah, and I think that's important, and it's in the U.S. It's almost like it's so much more difficult to do that now. Like you read about, the way I understand, Germany, like they have a much better apprenticeship kind of program, so that is something we should probably do here, and just get people, it's like, hey, let's get involved in the real world for 6 months a year, and and maybe add some school, on top of it. Because I understand completely what you're saying about law school. My brother went to a top tier law school, and he played college football in undergrad, and he started doing some college football coaching while he was in law school, and then he left law school and wanted to become a college football coach.
Right.
So, it did not work out, and he ended up becoming an attorney, but it was kind of caused a little bit of a mini crisis in our family. But I can kind of, I get what you're saying. It's just like, oh, we went through all this law school, and then he's like, no, but now my true passion is I want to be a college football. But it's, it was unrealistic. But you just right, you want to avoid that kind of stuff where you spend 3 years going to law school, and then you realize like, oh my God, I might get hired and I'll be stuck in this giant, bulge bracket, bureaucratic firm that, everybody's just, backstabbing each other or whatever they're doing. And,
right.
that is the reality a lot of times in those places. And, it just becomes really less appealing once you really put your mind, think about it. So.
Right. And the other aspect of it that's crazy about that is now it's a sunk cost variable, right? Because you look at that and you go, wait a minute, I already spent 10 years doing this, right? I hate this, but now I have to pay back this insane amount of money to at least be able to get back into a normal rhythm for life. So it creates sort of bitter people too, in the sense that now you've created the system. And I think the problem we really have with it is not so much the education. We love the idea of education. I think the problem we have is the idea of formal, standardized, systematic education, which puts a lot of restrictions in place, and the restrictions have a lot of unintended consequences. And so the people who tend to defend those systems, maybe they look at this slice of the pie where it's like, oh, look, this many people have gone through and here's what they've done. But then we always look at the other aspect of it as we say, look, the problem with any kind of formal education or any kind of test is that it tests you based on past knowledge, right? There's a right answer to this question. Please write it as you see fit. And you can go to English, you can go get a degree in English literature from Oxford and listen to the great explanations of, Shakespeare's works and all that. But that doesn't mean they're going to be like, well, now you can write the next book that's going to be studied for the next 400 years. Right. And compound that with the fact that we look at the world and we say, you talk to kids these days, oh, I'm going to this university, I'm going to that university. And there's this level of pride and enthusiasm, which is good. But then, I always ask one simple question. I'm like, how do you think the world ever did before universities were a thing? I
would say probably in some sense we were doing better, you know what I mean? But
right.
Because, if you think about it, what's the best school? I would say the best form of school is the real world and the school of hard knocks. You know what I mean?
Yep, of course.
And you could probably make the case that, if borrowing costs for student loans were higher and maybe some people did forego going to school and it was just like, no, I'm not going. I'm going to work anywhere. We might actually be better off. It just sort of looks scary from, from a 10,000 foot level when you say stuff like that. But, I think there's probably more to that than people think. And you're like, once the mindset develops as no, it's expensive, maybe I'll do some school on the side. But, the reality is I just want to be embedded like in the workforce in some capacity, and then it becomes easier if sort of the borrowing costs, like to borrow to go to school, maybe becomes high enough that you just say, screw it. You know what I mean? But right now it's just sort of, if you want to go to school, you can get the biggest pot of money you can imagine probably to do it. So it's just, but I don't know. I think there's probably some real truth to that. Just getting into the real world and, just try not to be school focused and like remember in the U.S. people really weren't going to college in the U.S. until maybe the mid 70s before and then obviously since then is when college is really picked up. But there's a lot of people there were a lot more people 40 years ago, 30 or 40 years ago that just didn't go to college. And I don't think their lives are terrible or anything. I'm sure a lot of them found, meaningful employment and they're okay. It's the once the politicians here, and the populace says, we need school. And, the politicians go, we need school. And, now we have this giant, school industry, just like we needed houses. So we had a giant, mortgage industry, and we kind of had some of those similar problems. Like, well, we'll just give everybody a house and let them borrow a lot of money to do it. And I kind of had a bunch of problems with that. So it's just, I guess in some sense our political system listens, but we don't always think through things over the long term that well.
Yeah, no, see, what's happened here is there's been a co-opting of the term education with schooling. And that's why you always hear, like, oh, you need to get an education. But for them, by 99% of the people, when you say you need to get an education, they assume it means you have to go to school, right? And I think the sleight of hand there is where the misleading and more rent-seeking really takes place, because what you could do is you could say education can mean anything. Education just means the process of acquiring a new skill. And like you and I stated, you can acquire that skill by actually doing the job a lot better than you could by theoretically learning about the job, right?
Right.
And so I think I think you and I, what it really boils down to is the cost-benefit analysis of school. The schooling is okay as long as the costs are within reach of a person being able to pay off their debts.
Absolutely.
But it's gotten so out of hand that it's basically a completely a null and void conversation to say, I don't even know how to start this. $100,000 in debt for a degree in pick major X, right? Unless you're doing something crazy good, you're not going to pay that off.
Yeah, and I think that's, it's a major issue. And the other problem is that, once the politics get involved, it gets very hard to dislodge the system and force it, and remove the incentives. And because we've seen government just never wants to cut subsidies or cut, things out.
Of course.
Once they're there forever, even though they're not, what we're doing is not helping, it's arguably hurting. And we just, we can't seem to just, roll stuff back, even though it would be a good idea. Because, think about it, the education industry in the U.S. is, obviously with every kid enrolled and more money thrown at it, it gets even more political power. You know what I mean? They have more resources to go to Congress and just say, hey, without us, the world will end. And that's, I think what every industry does. It's like, well, if this happens, the world's going to end. So don't cut us. And, we can't do it. And then, we just wind up in the, just slowly going backwards. And I don't know what the solution is. Maybe it'll fix itself, but we wish it would fix itself sooner and not, 10, 20 years in the future or whatever it is. So.
Yeah. You know what's scary about that? It's like there's this insidious layer that you can kind of point out to. And I mean that in the following sense. If you were to go and you're like a 17-year-old kid and you went to the bank and you said, hey, I have this idea for a fantastic business, blah, blah, blah. And can I get a loan? They would kind of laugh you out of the park. But you can walk into the same bank and say, hey, I need $300,000 loan because I got into Harvard. And they would be fighting over who can sign those papers for you fastest, right? Because there's a layer to that where they can say, hey, this is backed by the government and the government is basically mandated by the taxpayer. The taxpayer has been lulled into assuming that education equals schooling. And therefore, this vicious cycle creates itself. And the bank or whoever issues out these loans looks at that and says, well, here's a chance where I can lend out money, and the backer of it is the government who's prescribing these particular policies because there's subsidies built into all this. Meanwhile, the kid who comes in, and even after the graduation, if you need a loan for a business, it's much harder than it ever could be if you just said, I need a bigger loan for my postgraduate studies in whatever field. So there's this incentive built that artificially inflates the value of that which shouldn't be so heavily valued, right? And that's where I think our real problem comes into that, is because we can look at those layers of the structure that it's built around and we could say, hey, the incentives are misaligned here. And as a consequence, we're detrimentally doing more damage to society than we are, because look, the kids' rates of depression and suicide and anxiety and all these other things are increasing at a time when wealth and prosperity is also increasing. But yet there's such a massive disconnect in the inequality of wealth. All these aspects, if you tie all these things together, you can kind of see pieces and pockets of it where it's like, I look at it and I'm like, okay, I'm reminded of that incident where, 15 people are midgets, but they're looking at, pardon the term, are tiny little people who are looking at elephant on the foot and on the trunk and the nose and the ears, and they can't tell what they're looking at. But once in a while you get this little step back and see, oh, it's actually just an elephant in the room here. There's too many layers tied together and there's too much. And I think the underlying assumption of all this is that we're perpetually going to grow the economy. And I don't think that's necessarily true.
Sure. And if you think about it, it's sort of like, all the loans or debt we create is more or less a bet that the future is going to be better than the past. You know what I mean?
Right.
Because, that's the nature of the game. I mean, we saw this first, I think, think about the housing bubble we had, which was almost in some sense like not only American, but almost global, at least. And, it's like, okay, well, we can give you a mortgage loan for $400,000 because no problem, growth will be spectacular over the next 25 years and you'll have no problem repaying it. And that's
right.
And that's the same thing we're seeing in student loans. And, we're still not really learning that, it's really hard to forecast, where you're going to be working, what your wages are going to be like, what the economy will look like, even 6 months from now. You know what I mean? Like, we don't really have a great handle on that kind of stuff. And we're sort of not really learning. Some people are learning, but I think in some sense we aren't. And, we just don't live in a world where you went to work for IBM for 40 years and you got a gold watch at the end and your life was just sort of stagnant. Didn't you say, didn't you start out, were you a trainer for a while and then you got into software?
I was.
So exactly. Everyone's kind of had, different things they've been doing. And I think that's the nature of the world, but it just sort of requires a more conservative mindset, I guess, against trying to borrow against your future self. You know what I mean?
Right.
And,
right.
And you think about it too, once you sort of borrow against your future self, you sort of are using up people's balance sheets already. You know what I mean? They don't, there's only so much, capacity to expand your balance sheet before you're just sort of like, well, I can't, take on any more liabilities. And I think it's sort of insidious that we sort of believe that, I think governments and especially economists, they are just oblivious to this notion that, the dangers of leverage, and they seem to just actively encourage the use of leverage as a weakness. Yes. As like a means to really better ourselves, even though 99% of most individuals kind of know the danger. You know what I mean?
Right.
It's like the government or economists are like, no, it's like you can get a loan to go to school because this will lead to growth, but it's also just leading to huge amounts of debt everywhere. And then you're already pressuring younger people who are like, oh, well, I'm really young, but now I'm already owe $50,000 or something. Well, this is an uncomfortable feeling for most people. You know what I mean? And I think it causes a lot of anxiety and, like you said, depression and stuff like that, where they're like, wow, I'm already saddled with liabilities, and how am I going to get these repaid? And that's just a total failure of leadership. And we have, a bunch of knuckleheads that are, haven't, been asked to step aside and sort of, their ideas sort of been just taken out and shot or whatever because, they're not great ideas. And, we just, I don't know. This is something about, bad ideas sticking around longer than they should be. And we can't seem to get rid of them like we would, if a corporation or someone just, goes bankrupt or something because it's losing too much money. I don't know. It's just, we don't have that mechanism right now. So.
What's funny about that? A reminder of our friend Joe Norman, and he constantly talks about boundaries against which our assumptions are valid. And I look at it in the following regard, right? So when you look at pre-World War II, right, everybody was kind of in a similar boat all over the world. And then all of a sudden, there's this massive uplifting of you have a washing machine, which to most people, a washing machine is a washing machine. But in actuality, I wash clothes all the time. So I noticed this. The amount of time and effort it takes to wash those clothes, even with a machine, is ridiculous. Remove that machine, and it's like a whole day of productivity is wasted. You have to plan for this.
Oh, yeah.
Go get all these things. So the world started to notice the United States sort of uplifting at this trajectory that's really fast. And there was the highways came into play, the cars came in, so the exchange for routes for markets to get the farmers' food out to the public, so there was less food wasted and it didn't go to it didn't spoil. All those benefits started to accrue really, really quickly. But what's interesting is the population wasn't so big, so you started to notice a net boom a lot faster, and because of that boom, a lot more people came into because we had more children and all these other things started to happen, and then the rest of the world wanted to sort of mimic those steps.
Sure.
You know what I mean? It's like kind of threw everything off.
Yeah, because I think almost like capital is like all multiply. It like sort of multiplies.
Right.
It's not it's like a system that sort of you feed one input in, and that comes back out as more output. Every time you feed it back in. And I think that's exactly kind of, so it just proves that the system is just like, there's a lot of dependencies and, just stuff like that, feedback loops that sort of power the economy. And it's crazy to watch. And you're right, you have a couple hits, and then productivity goes up, and then people can have more children, and then the population gets larger, and then with a larger population, we have arguably more minds to sort of solve more problems. Usually, of course we create more of them too, but
of course.
But I think that's, I don't know. Like, I should listen to Joe. I listened a little bit of Michael and Jeffers' podcast, and I didn't have time for everything, but I wish I had had a chance to listen to Joe. So at some point I'll get in there, because complexity science is it's interesting stuff, and I sort of get the basics of it, but I don't know. It's like the new emerging field, right? It's just
right.
Everything is supposedly, hey, can't study the individual because the properties of the system are, that won't tell you about the system at large, right? Isn't that sort of the deal?
Yeah. And he talks about what happens when you reduce things to the basic fundamentals of it, and then in that process you lose the emergent property around it. So the first example he gave was literally based on that with the Mobius strip. But what I mean by all this that makes it interesting, that ties into all the rest of the stuff we've been talking about, is the disconnect between the energy required to make progress is one that's, in my view, tied directly to what your future options look like. So if you come out with debt and you have a low-paying job and there's no way in how you can afford a house, that's three things emotionally just punching you in the gut from the very minute you wake up to the minute you go to sleep, right? And that compounds itself because your options are so limited. And then if you made an error of, perhaps having a child too soon where you weren't financially capable of doing that, and now you have to do even more work just to get that child fed and taken care of. So a lot of these issues sort of wrap themselves around, and you turn into this mess of complexity soup, so to speak, of, too much debt, not enough options, low paying job, have to take the job because you need to feed the kid, can't upgrade your skills because you're feeding a kid and you're dealing with your other priorities. You get a sick parent, because all these things, as time unfurls, all these other issues sort of just kind of hitch along for the ride. When you're younger, your parents may be in okay health. As you graduate from school and you had a kid and all this debt, one of your parents gets sick, now you have to deal with that. So all these issues just sort of eat away at it. Meanwhile, on the other side of the world where, there was some level of nationalism to protect the population in general, are now basically taking your job. And now you have people coming in from other countries who not only do they have a degree, but they have like a master's degree. Right. So you look at all that and you see all the barriers that make the motivating factor of a human being to want to get up and go do something extremely daunting. And so I'm not surprised when I see a lot of people who are overwhelmed and, they're depressed. And then to compound that one more layer yet again, from the complexity point of view, you have all this junk food that's been heavily processed, ready to be eaten at any minute, with the pizzas and the burgers and the fries and the snacks that are put into the schools and all the other stuff. You look at that and you look at the lack. I mean, and I noticed this in one generation myself, which is when I was a kid, when school was finished, we would all run home, and we didn't have cell phones or anything. So what we would do is we'd say, hey, everybody come back here at 4:30. We're playing football today. And we would play. And when it was too dark, sometimes one of our parents would sort of randomly show up. Hey, everybody okay? Yeah, okay, good. Come home, dinner's ready, do your homework. But now I go outside, I don't see these kids, right? I'm like, well, and it creates this weird buffer zone, because the parents who are doing well, they get their kids enrolled in these programs where they pay for it. And the parents who aren't doing well, their kids are at home watching Netflix. And they're eating, and obviously not all of them, but a vast majority. And we're noticing this with the BMI index of the population for Canada and the United States for the past, let's say, 20 years. A lot more people are labeled unhealthy and obese than they used to be, right? So all these factors, low paying job, no future options, debts. And what's really interesting, and I wish somebody could really look into this, is like, what are the proclivities of a person who's buried in OSAP debt or school student loan debt to get buried in credit card debt? Because they're like, look, if the debt's insurmountable anyway, I'm just going to take on more of it. And then it reminds me of that saying, if I owe you $10,000, that's my problem. If I owe you $10 million, that's your problem, right?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting. I think that's sort of interesting. It's just like, this occurred to me a few times over the last couple of years, like reading at the student loan numbers. You're like, well, maybe you should take out a huge student loan, and you figure that, the taxpayer is going to eventually have to, bail everybody out. I don't know.
Right.
Like no one ever, I don't know if people don't think about that, but we seem to just be, that is like the where we're going, where everybody expects, someone to come to the rescue when we can't manage our finances. Like I read quite a bit about like Illinois', fiscal situation in Chicago, but there's, if you read any of these like muni bond, services, like there's probably, I think in the back of everybody's mind, it's always like, but the federal government could possibly orchestrate a bailout. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And
yes. The moral hazard.
And it's not unrealistic considering, we're in a situation where globally we've, central banks have printed, $20 trillion. Well, that is just an insane to say, if you 20 years ago, I don't think anybody really would have believed we would have done that, but that's what we've done. And so it's sort of building up this sort of idea that, it's like there is an entity out there to protect people's, finances and bad investments and stuff. And it's kind of scary that that's going on. And I don't know, I think it's hard to believe there aren't people engaging in strategies, at all sorts of levels saying, hey, there's going to be someone there to save me. And God, I mean, what if we had another housing took off again and people, loans became really cheap? I mean, think about how many other people will just say, well, I'm going to, throw caution to the wind and, get in as much real estate, leverage as I can. And if I win big, it's fine. And if I don't win big, well, the government will have to do something. You know what I mean? Go ahead.
No, what's scary about that is they have a legit case to make in the sense of the following way. They can say, how come you bail out the banks, but you can't bail out the student loans, right?
Right.
And from a moral point of view, you really don't have a say into that to say, look, you're right. We shouldn't have bailed out the banks, but we did. And we shouldn't have bailed out long-term capital, but we did. Right. We shouldn't have bailed out General Motors, but we did. But now it's your turn at the till, and you're asking, and we're saying no to you. You don't have the moral grounds to say no at that point. You should. Yeah, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and it's going to be a major issue again when we have another recession. In the U.S. and I'm sure probably some other places where people are, they remember, they're going to remember the things that were done to help other people. And it's going to be a really messy situation trying to figure that out. You know what I mean? And you have an entity like the Federal Reserve, which is essentially, enabling, they're sort of help us run more or less running like a Ponzi scheme where we have the same, that money, but, every month for the last 10 years or whatever, they've been buying more and more bonds. And so that relieves the government of having to, sell more and probably sell them at bad rates or not have enough buyers for them. So this is a major long-term, it's a big issue. And I don't know. I mean, it's like, I think, it's like Ray Dalio, I think, talks about this a lot too, where he, kind of alludes to these problems coming up, and he's always saying we're going to be at each other's throats in the next recession, and I think he's probably correct. You know what I mean? And the problems, stirring up inequality and bailouts, and it's just a big mess. And why are student loans? They're not. You can't declare bankruptcy with student loans.
Right. And they're tied to you.
Yeah, there's like no mechanism for releasing them, which is weird too. But it's just, boy, it really is like, because at some point, I think, the markets will probably peak and we'll begin to see, slowdown happen, and, probably get the usual stuff. Probably, the credit spreads will probably start widening as some, bankruptcies begin to pile up from the last 10 years. And then, what happens? Then, a big budget deficit and, national debt has just been run up through the roof. And, it could be a dicey situation. And a lot of people are going to realize that the system is just like, if we don't have skin in the game for people, everybody needs to have skin in the game. That's the issue.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
We can't have people just saying, oh, well, you're going to take these risks and there's, we're going to donate, the taxpayers there to bail you out. We just won't survive that. It's just it's a recipe for, social upheaval and, a lot of just angst and frustration and just the opinion that people are not being treated fairly. And I think, too, I think people are sort of getting the impression, too, that maybe the wealthy and the powerful, have a really big leg up. It's like you look at the Epstein thing in the U.S. and just reading the Twitter comments, I think there are a lot of people out there, like, there just are wealthy and powerful people that aren't playing by the rules. Or like the Sackler family, I think, who, the Purdue pharmaceuticals and the opioid stuff. And it just sort of reeks like, well, these people have billions and billions of dollars. They are sort of, complicit in sort of a mass murder, of a lot of people from, misleading about the dangers of opiate addiction. And then, really all they're really doing is having to do is cut a check. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I think that kind of irks people. There's no criminal wrongdoing or anything. And it's like, okay, well, you had $20 billion and now you have 15. Well,
right.
It's, most people's lives aren't really going to be affected, but I do think that is like an issue where people are seeing, stuff kind of happen that they realize that people are getting shielded from legal liability and then the most obvious one, banking. No one went to jail during the financial crisis because the government just decided that, they weren't going to do that, because it would be risky or something. You know what I mean? But, it's a really, really tough pill to swallow and say, well, we had to bail you out and now you pay all these bonuses. And then the response is like, oh, no, we can't touch them because they're critical to, getting the economy moving. Oh, sorry, something just beeped, I think. And so I don't know. It's just I think it's an important issue.
Well, what's interesting about that, because I thought about that issue for a number of years, right? So I kind of sat back and said, why wouldn't you sort of go after this institution that's basically become so parasitic at its core that the level of disdain for people who are in the financial sector is almost to the level where you can't even fathom it. And then I realized, I said, well, the biggest thing that the United States pushes out to the rest of the world is this idea of protecting your property rights. And in essence, the only way that actually can work is if you can own something without somebody taking it from you. And the people who facilitate that on the grandest scale are the people on Wall Street, because they allow you to trade stock, which becomes a piece of your property that you own from Apple or Google or whatever. And so to protect that ideal, they kind of have to bite the bullet on this other end of it, which is to allow this, rather corrupt process to unfurl itself. And these people who got all this money and every single one of them will give you the same example. I don't know. It wasn't really me. A whole bunch of things were involved, and it's like, who are you going to really take it out on? And so people have this level of vengeance and anger built up. And I think what you and I are starting to see here is there's this powder keg situation here where there's so much rage that's just waiting for an opportunity to just come to the top, right? And you see little bits and pieces of it here and there with the Occupy Wall Street movement and the whole Antifa thing and all. Every single one of these is invariably, from what I could see, tied to economic options being removed from the average person, right? So I see that connection. I'm like, hey, we can't just let people quote unquote suffer. As long as they've been doing things honestly and they keep getting the short end of the stick, you should not be surprised that there's all this anger built into it and there's all this backlash built into these things.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I think. Like you look at younger people, and I do anecdotally kind of like just what I'm reading on the internet is there are some, I think, intergenerational kind of backlash too, where it's like you see we almost have these like millennial versus baby boomer that sort of are stirring beneath the surface, which is disturbing because it's saying that, we're grouping generations against each other. And I think there's a lot of talk from like boomers saying, oh, well, millennials are lazy. And, in 1971, I marched to school 5 miles every morning, and I still pay my mortgage and all this other stuff, which I don't think is a kind of a crappy argument because I do think that younger people, like this recession, we didn't, really, it had a profound effect on it saved a lot of baby boomers, I would imagine, from being foreclosed on and, we're trying to pump up their stock portfolios and stuff. But it hasn't kind of filtered down into the kind of growth if you're younger in the sense that they want to get a job and an okay place to live. And instead we have a lot of younger people living at home. And then when the boomers, complain about, saying, oh, you shouldn't complain, they rightfully point out, they're like, look, you weren't living at home trying to find a job and had student debt you couldn't pay when you were 25 years old. And that's, I think it really is that is fundamentally correct. And, I think a lot of baby boomers, when the financial crisis hit, they were really in a really bad shape. They had borrowed too much. They, didn't protect their stock market portfolio, a lot of these things, and were losing their jobs. And, and then most of the benefits, I think, had kind of been more concentrated on some of their age group than younger people's age groups. And I think that creates sort of a feeling of jealousy and sort of, not jealousy, but just sort of, hey, I'm younger, I'm getting screwed here. And we're kind of in the mess because of what you guys did. And you went out and, you just did a bunch of really bad financial decisions. And the economy just hasn't been able to kind of grow in the dynamic sense that we had like in the 90s and before. And I think that just sort of leaves a sort of a bitter taste in your mouth. And it's like around Chicago too. I think a lot of younger people under the age of 30, it's like they're really burdened by costs. You know what I mean? Just getting like a place to live is, and I'm saying like not nice places to live, like, renting's gone up a lot and just other stuff. So, it's kind of just eats away at you. You know what I mean? And so it kind of makes a mockery of inflation because I think inflation is sort of, however they measure inflation is just the government. There's a million different ways to measure it. And the reality is it's like it's never spread evenly. You can have low inflation, but according to how the government wants to measure it, but then have a whole class of other people that are kind of just like really struggling to, keep things together. So
of course. And there's the other dynamic of it that's interesting, which is as follows, right? So you had the boomers, and I've always noticed this, right? So any game you walk into, and I learned this at a very young age, you need to understand that you're presuming it's a symmetrically fair, even playing field. And the day you become an adult, or sort of the idea of coming of age, is when you realize that almost every game you get into, it's asymmetric, and somebody somewhere has leverage that you don't know about. And if you don't pay attention, wealth transfer mechanisms will be put into place, i.e. there were people, and I'm giving a specific example, so let's please make sure our audience doesn't generalize it too far out, is the idea of the unions that, it just happened literally last year in Canada, which was that the GM plant, there's a whole area called Oshawa, which is built around the General Motors plant, and there are generations of people essentially just went from high school to getting a job in the union, and the jobs kept getting more lucrative, a lot more pay for not very much more productive output. And there was a built-in layer of assumption built in that, well, my granddad did it, my dad did it, I'm doing it, but my son can't do it, and they're angry about that. And the rest of us are kind of looking at this saying, well, just because you did that doesn't necessarily mean that the value that you're creating matches the standard of living you want the constant increases to come with. And so now you have this other problem, which we discussed on earlier, which was that the boomers had lots of kids, right? Their kids had some kids, but now this generation can't have any kids, but they have to financially support vis-a-vis tax mechanisms, debts that accrued from the people previous to them. And they can't have their own kids, and they don't have their own assets. So there's this, for the first time, I think, in human history, we're noticing that within one civilization, you have generational conflict where there's actual rage predicated from the younger ones to the older ones because they're being left off worse off than they started. Usually it's the other way around, right?
I think, younger people are probably, someone rightfully so, pointing out, they're like, look, there's no guarantee that my generation is going to be in better shape than, you guys were. And in fact, when I objectively look at the situation, it looks like I'm going to be in a worse situation. So then if you look at what, the resources that are going to be needed to provide for older generations as, we're kind of getting older and, America's aging and stuff, it sort of looks like a bad deal. And then, you're like, oh, I'm paying this Social Security, I'm doing all this, but it's like, I just don't have the money to do this. And then, a lot of this stuff was promised by some politician that died 35 years ago or 40 years ago. And it's a part of the system now. And it's like, no, you're on the hook for liabilities that you never voted for. And that's another, skin in the game problem. I mean, it's, we need more symmetry between, not having people vote for being able to vote other generations' money, to other people. And that's, really complicated stuff. But at some point, we're going to have to figure out a better way to do that, because that has been the deal in the U.S. forever. It's just sort of make all these promises, and then they don't really, and then, it's future generations' money, and then they never really have the money, so then they're borrowing more and more, and things just get out of control. It's like in Chicago, if you're a legacy Democrat system, and this goes along with economists too. Like I've noticed that, like, economists, and then some of these, like, in legacy, these big legacy cities, it's like they really take for granted that growth is, like, easy to come by. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So they don't live in the real world. So, like, economists always are just like, oh, no problem, because we just borrow a lot because the economy is just so easy to figure out. And, and as long as they get the money, we'll just have, great growth, and, things are just so simple. But they're not business people, and they don't realize how hard it is to actually build a business and make it profitable and all this other stuff. So they, have no problems being like, oh, we can tax the wealthy more, and all this other nonsense. It's like, you can't. It's just harder. It's just a much, much, much harder thing to do than you think. And they just assume that the world is, like, really they have no concept of reality. It's just a very simplified way of looking at things where they don't understand how we're growing, or the difficult ways of just putting your money on the line and and trying to make things work. They just don't get that stuff. So they just have no problem just saying, okay, well, we can tax more and all this other stuff. But you can't, you can't. Eventually, you just run into huge problems.
Right.
So can you just explain modern monetary policy?
Oh, MMT? Sure.
Yep.
So you think about what MMT is like, how does the government usually fund itself if it's not if it's not through taxes? Like, what it does is, it sells bonds, and those bonds have, coupons and, maturity dates and all that other stuff. And, and they, someone buys them and says in 2021, you get your, principal plus your interest back. Well, because that's the way things are done. You have to sell a bond to finance yourself. MMT would just be like, there's no bonds at all. You would just essentially plug in a bunch of money into someone's bank account and just zip it right to them. So that's the difference. And people don't realize, like, because governments, if governments can't raise taxes, they have to borrow from someone, and that's the way they get resources. And this is just sort of like a scam to try and avoid that, unpleasant, reality. And I don't know, this NFT thing, like all the money printing and stuff, it kind of reminds me a lot of like past like financial media. It's like tech stocks in the 90s, where people are just sort of grasping to really bad ideas, or ideas that aren't really great. You know what I mean? Like, it's like, oh, you can run an unprofitable business, or housing, where everyone's like, oh, my house will go up, 8% a year forever. It doesn't matter what price. And then, so this kind of talk reminds me of just sort of like a collective, it's like another madness kind of thing, where you can just sort of violate, all the, thousands of years of history. It says that, no, you really can't print money safely. No one's ever been able to do it. And you eventually run into problems. So and then like you read about inflation. It's like if you remember in the 1920s. Like when Germany, like when Weimar had a big problem, they printed money for a few years and nothing really happened. And then one day inflation just exploded. They had that thing called like the wheelbarrow year. Where it was like everybody's walking around with like wheelbarrows full of cash. So it sort of looks really seductive. I think you can just, get something for nothing. You know what I mean?
Right.
I think the evidence says that maybe for a little bit you can, but not over the long haul, and you could never rely on this as something reliable. Like when they keep talking about more quantitative easing, I keep thinking to myself, well, I'm like, this is not reliable. You know what I mean? You can't use this on a consistent basis, and it's in a safe way to make it reliable. So, does that make sense?
Yeah, no, it does, and it's kind of scary from the following point of view, right? Because we've never seen the world's largest economy ever sputter to the point where it had the government that's backing it has to declare bankruptcy. I mean, bankruptcy of governments. Most people aren't aware, but a lot of other governments do declare bankruptcy because they just can't fund their various misadventures. But it's never been, and it's always under the assumption that the greenback was always going to be fine. And yet the people who are in charge of it continuously make these assumptions that are not rooted in reality, as you stated. And so if you look at the next collapse that may come, and it comes with all the student debt tied to it, with all these bubbles tied to it, with all this monetary policy, and then if the biggest bank or the biggest government in the world declares bankruptcy, sort of like they can't pay their bills, I don't even know what that would look like, right? I
think it would be a disaster, and the screwy part of what we're doing is that we're risking doing that. I think arguably to have saved banks and other people from 10 years ago. So it's like we're taking one risk, we're trying to save some people by taking even greater risks that we shouldn't be doing. You know what I mean?
Right.
10 years ago, we could have said, okay, we have a problem with banks. We need to do some sort of orderly bankruptcy and put a lot of people and institutions through this stuff. But, and it would have been painful, but then we wouldn't increase the systematic risk, their system risk, by loading the system up with lots of public debt, which is really, really more complicated. And, there's no public bankruptcy, and people don't even really know what public debt is. Like, at least with private debt, you can kind of say, okay, well, we can work out a deal, and if some people lose some money, that's fine. Instead, you have, $23 trillion, that's the official amount of debt we owe. But, I think the numbers are probably, higher than that there's more hidden liabilities and stuff like that. But so you're sort of taking one risk and gambling with a much bigger risk. And, we would never want to see a situation where, the U.S. got in trouble. But I think unfortunately what's going on is like we haven't seen the U.S. interest rates rise or anything, but we've seen other large countries where this has happened. Like Italy's has got a public debt problem. That's like the sixth largest country by GDP in the world. So things are kind of stuff that would have been unthinkable for big developed countries to get in fiscal problems. Like the reality is that they have fiscal problems. So we used to just kind of be like, oh, well, Argentina or these kind of places that, were not the wealthiest places is sort of moving closer to us. And, we just can't seem politically, we can't seem to, do anything about budgets or anything. And they're just, so I think every day, the risks are probably, they get higher, like it's, tiny bits every day. You're sort of getting into more and more trouble. So it's, you're right. I mean, like, what would it be like if the U.S. had a fiscal problem and, we're essentially in charge of, 75% of the world's military, you know what I mean? Or whatever. And just the mess of just, being, that kind of stuff and having, we would probably have, jeopardized, global, safety to a certain extent too. You know what I mean? But we can't seem to get, out of our own way. We just, I don't know. It's a mess.
Well, what's interesting about that is, and it just happened in the last 10 years or so in Canada, maybe a little bit before that, but I'll give you a sort of a weird thing that I've been witnessing, which is that a lot of money's been flowing in from China and buying up real estate across Canada like you wouldn't believe, right? People can't afford homes simply because the market for purchasing that is insanely out of whack with reality. Mm-hmm. And the people who are flowing that capital out of those countries and coming into this one, a lot of the times the homes are vacant, right? The condos that are being bought are vacant, but it's what it is they're taking the money from that economy, recognizing the potential risk of having the government one day say, all right, we're not following the ideology that we're supposed to. Everybody's wealth gets rejected back into our economy, so we're going to take away all your stuff. They figured, I know what the best thing I could do is I could just go out abroad and buy some real estate, and they can't touch that because I could put that in the name of my son who will live in that country, right, and they won't be able to touch all that. So this mechanism started to sort of play itself out. And then the Canadian government came in and said, all right, we're going to tax these people, or there's going to be an extra 25% that they have to pay for this. And they didn't even flinch, right? All it did was nothing. Like, in essence, it's supposed to cool the market down a little bit for the housing in these areas. None of that happened because, again, there's so much money out there. And I started to look at this, right, and I tie it into the following aspect of it. It's kind of like this. It's a really interesting and weird way to look at it. And I'll be happy to take your take on it. But it's like imagine you're the government and you started to notice the narco market sort of sprouting up in South America. And at first, they're bad guys. They're building drugs and, all this stuff. And it's okay. We can kind of manage it. But then every time they get wealthier, they become much more dangerous, right? To the point where you can arrest one guy and another guy will just sprout up on its top and he'll take over. Now there's billions of dollars being generated. So it's this whole other economy that's being built. 300 billion last time I heard. And so whatever, you started off with a small problem of wealth transfer, because in those areas where this particular set of ideas sort of proliferate, wealth transfer is the first thing that happens, right? So the people, their safety is at risk, so they can't go to work as much. And, the police are overwhelmed, so the police become corrupt because the drug dealer who has, $10 million a day to spend can afford to pay the cop a little bit of money so he doesn't have to be arrested. So all these sort of mechanisms sort of feed back into itself, right? So in the United States and in Canada, we don't have that particular problem, but we notice it in other areas, right? Sort of the same mechanism, just manifesting itself in a different way. And like you said, they're giving out bonds that are last I checked, I saw there's a bond for 100 years. I'm like, who in the world would want to sign a loan for 100 years? Because it's like you're assuming that you're not confident about the future. And their presumption is, I'm going to buy this, get the loan, and then I'm going to give it to my kids. But then you're still assuming that in 100 years, they're going to honor that loan, right? So you're basically throwing money out the door.
Yeah.
To a group of people who may not necessarily, they're not going to think 100. They're thinking next election cycle. You think they're going to honor your 100-year debt? Come on, let's be real here, right?
Well,
that's a misallocation of resources.
Yeah, and 100-year bonds, I think, does, if you have a realistic look at the world history, you're like, man, who the heck knows what 100 years will look right now? I mean, 100 years ago, the U.S. was still, God, we had a civil war in 1865. I don't know. The world is just so messy. It's just hard to even conceive of loaning your money for that duration, And there's probably a realistic chance that no one, I don't know, that the population of the world shrunk by half by then. I don't know. It's a crazy way to think about it, and it just shows, the things in fixed income world people are really, really desperate for any kind of yield they can get, and I think they think that there's not a bubble or something like that, but they're probably, really, really they're absolutely pushing the line. Providing any kind of negative yielding debt, it's it's insane, and I don't know. We're just governments are sort of kind of turning the world upside down with, their central banks and their policies towards, interest rates. And they view interest rates as like a tool to sort of fix growth and stuff. But, they just don't think through the unintended consequences very well. And then they don't feel any remorse or guilt about sort of deliberately putting people into certain asset classes, and that's kind of what they've done too, by sort of just kind of really, really kind of manipulating free markets. They're determined to clamp interest rates down to zero, and they just don't really care. How that they have their own opinion on that, and they don't want to hear anybody else's opinion.
That's his opinion.
Why it might not be a good idea, and that's just kind of a disturbing way to look at it, and it's very pompous and kind of just arrogant too. It's like, well, we're gonna control the marketplace and just determine that everybody gets this interest rate, and if you don't want to hear about it, if you don't like it, we're just going to tell you to screw off or whatever. So it's bad. I think it's a bad deal. So.
Yeah. What's interesting about that, and it ties back to what you were stating earlier, and I look at it in this way, right? So people, like, I hear all the time, like, oh, we have a climate change problem, all this other stuff, and everybody's solution is we're just going to innovate this. So I'm like, okay. Here's where this problem really lies. And I know this because I look at the number of people who are like really, really smart and have the effect to change the world. And I look at entrepreneurs who are really, really actually entrepreneurs who don't build these nonsense companies that just generate paper profits. I'm talking like real, things that actually can, like, objective things you can grab a hold of to say this made somebody's life better. And so this is the thing, right? So you have this population that go, oh, more eyes on the problem equals better solutions. I'm like, no, that's not true, because here's the difference. When you have people who actually move things forward from the point of view of they have insight into the unknown and they generate some wealth out of it or generate some deeper understanding for it, it's not like a tug of war where you just want more people pulling. This is more like a race, and then the race is complicated because it's a race through a jungle. Right? So not only does more people does not guarantee you anything, because if you have more people and they're just more idiots, that's not necessarily going to net benefit you, because there are more people doing this, right? So this disconnect between, if we have more people, we will create more companies, we will create more jobs, and we will create more benefits, and we'll create more prosperity. All of that is presuming that everybody's equal, and that's not true. And you need like, and all you have to do is look at it and say, okay, how many Newtons and Einsteins have we had? Right? How many Mozarts have we had?
Because it's just, the reality is that, wealth and probably progress in general is like, fat-tailed, where it's just a few people are more or less responsible for a lot of, the growth we're getting. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like, you need one individual like Steve Jobs, and he sort of just brings, I don't know, 100 million people out of poverty. You know what I mean? Like,
of course.
Or something like that, and that's maybe a little exaggerating, but it's like, he's a guy who has like a great idea, and he's a great entrepreneur, and he's a great businessman, and he's all these other things, and you realize that a lot of other people, like 99.9% of the people, they're not these people. You know what I mean?
Yes.
They can't do this stuff. And that's why it looks bad when you're taxing people's wealth, because you realize, like, no, it's like these other people, they're riding Bill Gates's coattails or Larry Ellison's coattails. That is the bottom line. I'm not saying they don't get some support, but these are people that are, they may have some, there's always some luck involved, but
of course,
but they really are the kind of people that have the risk taking and the skills to make great products and sell stuff. And if we didn't have those people, we would just have nothing. You know what I mean? Everyone would be poor. You know what I mean? There would be nobody. So that's I think people, that's sort of maybe uncomfortable for people to think about, but I think that like intuitively makes sense to me. And there's a lot of people out there that just aren't really great risk takers. You know what I mean? And that doesn't mean they're not like great people or they're not smart, but they're maybe just not people that can kind of build a business and come up with some great ideas. And that really is this a selective group of people that really can do that. And then everybody kind of people benefit from them. They get hired by these people. Steve Jobs or, all these whatever. It's like, well, you come work at Apple and make $250,000 a year or something like that. And, that's great. You're not, you didn't come up with the iPhone, but, I'm paying you a lot to, help sell them and stuff like that. So.
Right. So it's interesting on that front. I'll give you 2 points to that. One, I highly, highly, highly recommend the Ken Burns documentary on the life of Mark Twain, who's one of my favorite authors of all time. Okay. But Mark Twain, if you like, you're going to watch this documentary, like this was a truly gifted human being who's also lived a very tragic life. And one of the things that was interesting about him was he made a lot of money with his books, and every ounce of his money that he made horrible investments and kept losing money. So, right? So he had to go on these lecture tours, and it just destroyed his life from multiple angles. But like, just if you're ever just like wanting to learn, and I think Twain was the original. You know, people will make this argument that it's either Twain or Herman Melville that started the American literature revolution, sort of, because that's the first great authors that came out of the U.S. But I think anybody who just really wants to have a fantastic point of view of a game changer, reading Twain is one of those people. But looking at his lifestyle will actually match that.
So I have an interesting point to add about Mark Twain and his investments, and this is like what people don't think about either, is that, okay, Mark Twain obviously was a brilliant writer, and, you know, didn't he toured all over Europe and stuff like that, right, when his book, and so he was a really talented writer. But, you know, what did he do? Instead of just perhaps socking his money away, you know, in the bank or whatever, you know, he decided to get into investing and lost a bunch of money. And I think that's what a lot of people end up doing. You know what I mean? Yeah. Because we're sort of taught to sort of like, okay, you're in software, or you're, you know, a dentist, and then, you know, the finance industry or the investment industry comes after you. It's like, no, it's like, you got to get 8% a year, and then you got to, you know, you have to, you know, have this portfolio set up like this. But they just don't often understand that the risks are higher than are assumed, and they end up, you know, doing worse than if they just put their money in, you know, a 4% savings bond. You know what I mean?
Yeah. Or just buying some property.
Or anything like that. But just, you know, because you're sort of taught to, like, well, you know, you got to lend out, you know, you got to take your savings and sort of lend it out in all these different ways. And it sort of looks safer than it actually is. And I think, and especially because we don't have, busts very often, you know, you kind of, it's easy to sort of think that, you know, you can sort of, you know, that buying stocks is easy. It's like in the 90s. You remember in the 90s, it was like, we had a, you know, 10-year bull market, and, you know, everyone, I'm sure, in 1999 had, you know, a lot of gains accumulated, and they were listening to every guy, you know, finance guy being like, oh, well, the market, you know, returns 8% a year or something like that. And they're like, great, I'm investing as much as I can. And then, you know, 2000 hits and the market loses, you know, 44% of its value. So you've lost all 10 years of your gains. You know what I mean?
Yeah, of course.
And people, you know, I think because these don't show up very often, you just think that it's safer than it is, and you don't realize that there's like a bust. And that's like, you know, it's like talking about skew earlier in when we were talking earlier. It's like, you know, the skew is to the downside, and it's a lot bigger than people think, and you just don't. It's easy to forget about it because it just doesn't happen very often. You know, we have. Right. You know, we have long booms, you know, fast busts, you know, and similar thing to, you know, like, you know, when we had a property bubble, you know, prices for, you know, houses rose, and then, you know, when they go down a lot faster than you would think. And, you know, it's just, you know, but that's the same thing. It's like Mark Twain. It's like, hey, it's like, focus on what you're good at. You're a good
Yes.
Like you're not a great investor. You know what I mean?
No, you really aren't. No. And
what did he? What were some of the things he lost his money on? Do you remember?
I remember it was a lot to do with oh my God, I'm trying to remember right now. But there was this whole boom about technology even in that time. With you know, the washing machines and all the electric. Remember those fair movies you'd see? Oh, in the future everything is going to be like this, and it's a lot of those people because the thing with Twain, and I'll draw a parallel for you. The thing with Twain that happened was that he would have these amazing parties where he was obviously the life of the party because of his wit. I think besides Oscar Wilde, those were my 1 and 2. I don't think anybody could match Twain's wit.
And think about this: what if Microsoft had won, and the operating platform for mobile phones was Windows based?
Yeah, exactly.
like, I mean, and that was, I think, almost like sort of a reality. I mean, they were working on it. You know what I mean?
They were.
And it didn't
They were
work
just
out.
too late.
They were too late or whatever. They're like, oh my God. It's like, thank God. Can you imagine? I mean, it'd be awful. Everyone would be, you know, rebooting their phones all the time. And so it's just like, it is probably just a stroke of luck that, it came up with the iPhone, and then the operating system and all that other stuff is just so much more stable than, Windows. And, thank God they didn't, infect the planet with Windows, based PCs on our phones too.
Right. What's hilarious about that, and this is where I could tell people, because I watched the interviews of Steve Ballmer with Charlie Rose, and I watched interviews of him when the iPhone was being introduced and how he laughed at it. And then I have friends who work at Apple and I have friends who work at Microsoft. So I'm sort of somewhat privy to some information. But here's what's interesting about that. What's interesting about that is when Steve wanted the phone, he actually said to them, just start from scratch and figure it out, right? So they had two versions of the operating system. One was based on what the iPod was running, and one was based on what the Mac was running. And he created two teams and said, I don't care, just figure it out, make it work. Mm-hmm. Where at Microsoft, their strategy was our cash cow, our bread and our butter and our steak and our French fries are all at Windows. Take Windows and shoehorn it into this thing. Yeah. And because of that initial limitation, they lost ground because they took and this is exactly the kind of a conversation we love at Risky Conversations, which is what we've had. Is they looked in the mirror and they tried to project what they've already seen into the future. Whereas Steve did the exact opposite. He goes, I don't know which version is going to work. You guys figure it out. He created two teams and had them compete against each other and said, whichever team gets the answer right is the one we're going to go with. And that's the difference between the risk taker who recognizes the capacity for luck and the capacity for not doing top-down planning on that front. Because there are a lot of people think, it's a lot of top-down planning, but some of the friends I have who work there will tell you that what they do is they gather around and they have like the best people from each department, and it's like a secret process of nomination of how you get invited to this. And they gather around and they have 100 ideas they put on the board. And it's okay, these are the 100 ideas, and here's our overall strategy, and here are pieces that we already have in place, and where do we want to go? And so once they come up with these 100 ideas, they say, okay, now let's take this to the 10 best ideas. And then once we get the 10 best ideas, let's prioritize them, and we're going to tackle them according to timelines of deliverables. And if we can't deliver it on iOS 13, we'll slate it for iOS 13.1 or 13.2. But nonetheless, that process is never predetermined, because there's an interview of Steve Jobs himself. If you watch it, he says that one of the worst things you could do is try to project further than 5 years. You just can't do it. Because if you're doing that, you have to presume that the market in the tech world stays the way it is right now. And then you don't know who your competitor is going to bring out onto the market. You don't know what they're going to do. So if you go past 5 years, you're essentially wasting money. So their R&D department is a lot different than most tech companies who have quote unquote moonshots. And Microsoft has this crazy table called Surface that they unveiled, but they never made into a product. And Google has this, we're going to put up blimps, and it never really materialized. But Steve's money, all their money is invested in like operations. Let's buy new tools, let's invest in new capacities, let's do all these things so we can build products, because they're based on reality. And the rest of these guys, because they're so software driven, everything is quote unquote, we'll just kind of code it out and figure it out. And I think that's sort of the difference. That's just my gathering from an outside perspective.
I always thought, or the way I understand it too, is that when he came back to Apple, one of the interesting things he did, when this would probably be really hard for Microsoft to do because they're so attached to Windows, that he just started cutting every product line that wasn't selling. You know what I mean?
Right.
And that's hard to do in a big organization. You know what I mean? But he was able to do that. And then you're all of a sudden like, okay, these things are gone. It's like, now what do we, it's like, now we need to, now we have our best people and our resources on focusing on building something new that's going to really work. You know what I mean? And that makes sense, but I think that's like really hard. Just the way I understand like organizations, big place, that can be really, really hard to do. You're fighting a lot of legacies. You know what I mean? And, but hey, it really worked out well. And, like it sounds like Microsoft seems like the kind of place where, Bill Gates is like not that he's not necessarily a creative person per se. You know what I mean? So
Right.
he's not like the kind of boss that's going to walk into your walk into your team with the new ideas and be like, I've got this idea, I guess. That's what it doesn't seem like. You know what I mean?
Right.
I don't know. That's just my own. I could be wrong though. I just don't know.
Well, we all speculate to the best of our abilities, but we have observational data to go with. So we'll tell everybody what we always tell them. It's like, take what I say with a grain of sand on Sunday, and with a bucket of salt during the week, right?
Right.
So what do you think is wrong with the field of economics?
Oh man, this is like a massive subject. I mean,
She brings out the best questions, right?
I just think it's like all wrong, and it's almost like they've never discovered any laws. So it's like, they claim that they've figured some laws out, but once you dig down to the surface, you realize that they haven't. And it's like, I'll give you a great example. There's this thing called the Phillips curve, which was like just discovered in like the 60s, I think, 50s, late 50s, 60s, something like that. And the economists did some regressions basically. It was like, well, there's a trade-off between unemployment and wage growth and stuff, and it's sort of like you build the regression, and it has like a really nice straight line and showing that there's some sort of dependency, but it just like in stats, like correlation isn't causation. So just because there's some correlation, it doesn't necessarily mean that one's causing the other. But instead they use other stuff like that and other stuff to sort of kind of shape their policy ideas. And then they find out 10 years later that correlation just disappears. You know what I mean? Or it's just like not, or it's so weak now that it's almost unreliable. And, and then it's like in the financial crisis, they don't seem to ever think like, leverage could be a big problem. And, so they miss that. And it's like, well, you look at leverage in the U.S., it's like it's so much higher than it was, since the early 80s. So it's like, obviously, leverage is dangerous and high levels of leverage, and they just don't, I don't know. They just sort of miss that. And then they're just very cavalier about, using debt as like a growth mechanism, despite, everybody knowing for the most part that it's like getting a lot of debt is kind of risky. You know what I mean? But they seem to be heavily promoting this as just like a tool to get growth, and they don't seem to really maybe it's the same thing because they don't have skin in the game, and they're not washed out of their ideas don't seem to get washed out. They keep promoting things that don't really make sense, and I don't know. And it's like everything else, they circle their bandwagons, I think, and try and protect the field, so they don't look incompetent. And then the other thing is they're wrong about forecasting. The tools they have, they use try to use econometrics, which is just not really telling us anything. And you think about, in order to get growth, I mean, it's like what Hayek say. It's like the object of economics is to spur men's imaginations about what they can design. That's like that's not exact quote, but it's something. But you think about it, so it's like, well, we don't really know what growth will look like next year. It really is ultimately dependent on what kind of the money that entrepreneurs can get and turn and build new and profitable businesses, right? And we don't really know what, we have no idea, what those businesses are going to be. We didn't. No one. You look at the internet. In the probably early 1990s, there were plenty of people probably saying, "Oh, this thing is crap. It's never going to amount to anything." And then 6 years later, it's the potential of it is obvious. You know what I mean? But we just don't. We don't have any idea like what growth will look like. It really is just dependent on people managing their risks properly and having some capital to work with, and then building businesses that are sustainable and profitable. And that's not easy. Like look at this week. There was a lot of the unicorn tech stuff has been pulled back, like WeWork and you know, and all this other stuff. And it's like, oh, these are big, supposedly big ideas, and they just lose money like crazy. You know what I mean? It's just hard to really know what's going to go on. And then most of the growth is sort of just from, you know, the tail. Like Apple, I think as Apple got bigger and bigger, it was almost like, what, 1 or 2% of like the whole GDP of the U.S.? I don't know. It's a huge number. You know what I mean?
Right.
So you realize it's like one business and success story is really accounting for everything else, and everything else is either small or doesn't work. It's like you watch Shark Tank and you think how many times, like how many new businesses are pitched, and they don't make any money, or they make small amounts of money. You know what I mean?
Right. And
then and I think they had that one business. It was like the Amazon bought. It was like the Ring, the doorbell, I think.
Yes.
And that business is probably the equivalent of all, you know, every other company that they've ever sponsored combined. You know what I mean? So it's just one. So you just have like one moonshot, and it really, you know, represents like all the growth, and they just don't. I don't know. They don't get that, and I don't know. It's just. You could go on and on forever. So
I was under the impression that supply and demand laws were pretty good. Is that also incorrect, or is that they extracted it beyond reason?
Well, you get it. Okay. Well, you get into, I don't know. There's all sorts of. When you get into supply demand, I think it gets more complicated, because you get into like something like, you know, Say's law. It's like, well, demand creates its own supply and stuff like that. So I don't know. It's just what I think is just like most important though. Is just that, you know, it's all about like a few large scores. You know what I mean? That sort of really make everything work right. And you look at. You know, it's like you look at Facebook, and I was like looking at their, you know, their earnings and stuff, and it's like, and then I was looking at like the largest like mall REITs in the country, which are like real estate investment trusts, and I'm like, man, I think I was doing the math, and it's like Facebook earns as much profit as if you were to earn like, if you have like 700 million square feet of real estate. You know what I mean? And you just realize, like, you know, just. I don't know how weird things can be, and for economic growth, and how big, you know, some things can turn out to be. You know what I mean? You're like, how can you own all that real estate, and you're one Facebook? You know what I mean? But that's, you know, that's reality. So.
You know what's interesting about that is when I look at that, I notice there's this weird trend that's really been around since. Early 2000s that I could remember, which is this idea that everything is about market share, right? The only company I know that keeps track of the proper score, which is profits, is Apple. Everybody else is market share. Android's market share is this, and Samsung's market share is that, and Amazon's market share is this, and they're eating all that. And that's also an arrogant bet to the future, that eventually they're going to turn that market share into profits, and it's not true.
Yeah.
It's consistently proven to be not true.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, yeah, and I think too, like I always found Jeff Bezos' strategy to be sort of weird. It's like, we're gonna lose money to pick up market share, but I'm like, I don't know. I just find that whole philosophy, like starting from that point, seems kind of weird to me. It's like,
right?
Why not focus on just making something that's going to make money? You know what I mean? Instead, it's like this war of attrition. You know what I mean? It's like we're going to wear you down until, you know, and then muscle in here. And I'm like, I don't know. It's just, I don't think Steve Jobs approached, you know, stuff like that, which is like a different way of looking at it. But I don't know. I just don't. Yeah, it's like market share, but I don't know. It's like a weird. I say, you know, take more money and fail more often until you find like a great product, rather than focusing on, you know, this game of, you know, gating market share and subtracting, you know, making, you know, keeping your profits low or whatever and stuff like that. Because you think about Amazon, it's like, you know, on the retail side of it, I mean, essentially it's like a very, very large Walmart that delivers. You know what I mean?
Right. And
you're kind of like, well, Walmart already has it by revenue, you know, it does a lot of revenue, but by its profit margins compared to its revenue are pretty small. You know what I mean? So it's a thin margin business. So it's like you're gonna be Amazon, you're gonna get into that business. Like we're kind of attacking like a business that has thin margins. You know what I mean? Like I mean on the retail side, I know like they've made more money in this AWS stuff, but it just sort of seems kind of weird. It's like, I guess it's fashionable. You would probably know better than me, but it seems like it's fashionable in like the VC and the tech world to like disrupt existing businesses.
Yes.
But like I don't know if that's like, and I'm not saying that isn't, I'm not saying that's irrational, but I don't know if that's maybe the best way to look at it. You know what I mean? Like just, it's like, well, we just go out and find existing businesses to attack. But I don't know, like you see like a lot of attacking going on and think it's not really working very well,
Yeah.
Like you haven't really been able to find like, there just isn't enough there to disrupt, these existing industries. But I don't know. I guess that is the way VC thinks, I guess.
Well, I'll tell you what my take on that is. And my take on that is, first of all, I blame Clayton Christensen and his book on disruption, right? So so that's my first. I'm like, oh my god, everybody read that book and I turned it into their modus operandi. But the bigger problem is this, right? So this again goes back to the ideas of complexity and Joe and all the guys, is that there's a layer of redundancy missing from certain businesses. Now, I'm not the kind of person who would bet against Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. But at the same time, though, I would never be a shareholder of their companies for one specific reason. Take away Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk tomorrow, like God forbid something happens to them or they just retire or whatever happens, right? They're no longer there. All the credibility of that stock is tied to quote unquote their founder, right? Yeah. And their founder missing, I don't think those companies survive that long, because that whole trust in the brand that they're pushing out there is so heavily tied to that founder. It's almost like a cult-like approach to it. Whereas Apple has experienced that the first time when Steve was kicked out, and the second time when he came back and he handpicked his successor. Mind you, to this day, people are still doubting Tim Cook and his ability to deliver, and time will test that out as well. But I've also noticed Microsoft, right? Bill Gates had the perfect opportunity to hand select his successor, and I think to a large extent he could have picked better candidates. But these other companies, like you said, what really rubs you the wrong way, and maybe I kind of highlighted it better, but is that what happens to Amazon if Jeff is no longer the CEO and the founder, right? Do they still get this amount of slack from the market? They're giving them price to earnings ratio of a multiple of like 1,000 sometimes. Once I saw it, I was like, it cannot be serious that you're going to give somebody 1,000 to 1 price to earnings ratio on that multiple. Like that's insane, right? 2 or 3 times. Yeah, okay. 3 times, 9 times, okay. 1,000? Now we're way out of reality here. And their assumption is once they dominate everybody, they will flip the switch and all of a sudden profits will start gushing in. And same thing with Google, this whole idea of, we'll just take moonshots. And it's because, and I've noticed this many, many, many times. I'm like, look, search was a human requirement that we all had. Innately, it's built into us because we look for things. Mm-hmm. They just converted that into a digital form that everybody resonated with, and they became dominant. That's funded everything else that's lost money. But yet, for some reason, they make so much money off that one business that it funds everything else. Whereas Apple, everything they do, if it doesn't make money, like you said, they cut it loose, right? The watch makes money, the phone makes money, the iPads make money, the store makes money, the Mac makes money. The actual retail square footage, I think the only thing they said per square foot that makes more money than Apple is the White House, for obvious reasons.
Right.
So what are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting about Jeff Bezos, and I don't know. It's like, you're right. I mean, he's the kind of person, Amazon is such a Goliath that it seems so complicated to me. Like and they're in so many businesses and stuff. I mean, getting just like getting another CEO just to run that whole operation. Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I agree with you. It would be, as a shareholder, kind of be,
a risky proposition.
Yeah. Risky, all that, and I don't know. And he probably is the kind of person who's, I think in the tech community, he's looked like, is viewed as a Steve Jobs, I guess. So there's people, think he's, he has a big talent, and I don't know. You're right. I haven't thought about that, but I don't know. It's just, I think Amazon is a sort of I should talk about it because I don't trade it, and I don't want to be skin in the game. I don't want to get too much into seeing make it seem like I'm long or short it, but that's so. I'll just leave it at that. How about that?
Yeah, no, and it's sort of like what I said, right? It's like I wouldn't bet against them, but I also don't bet on them for that very reason, right? Right. So we'll leave it at that. But is there any other topics that you would like to touch on?
No, but I just want to say I really appreciate you guys, the podcast, and I think I've looked at some of the other guests, and I really want to get a chance to listen to everybody else who's been on it, and I think it's just a really great idea what you guys have set up, and I really appreciate you having me on, I guess.
No problem. It was our pleasure to have you on. What we do have is one last set of fire questions that we're going to throw in your direction.
Okay.
We'll start with Ember here, because she may have her list that she usually goes through.
Yeah. What kind of books would you recommend? What are your top 3?
Oh man, I'm totally laughing because if you came up to my place, I have probably like 400 books laying around.
Oh, wow.
There's a lot of books. 400 is maybe exaggeration, probably 300. But I don't know. I'm a little behind on book reading lately, only because I've been studying for this risk management exam. But I'll tell you, what have I been? I've been trying to finish up the Battle Cry Freedom, which is like just one of the major history books on the Civil War, and I've been really liking that. I've been reading Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas by Hunter S. Thompson, and actually I've kind of enjoyed that just because it's kind of an anachronism in some sense. It was written in the early 70s, and now some of the stuff he's writing about seems sort of not that foreign, but when he was writing the book, it was like, he was sort of a rebel against, I think, really stodgy, conservative, heavy God people that were really, really, conservatives that were a little more powerful, I think, at that time than now. And now we kind of live in a world where it's almost like everyone wants to kill conservatives. So I think it's kind of funny when, you kind of realize that there was a time when conservatives were really annoying to like this counterculture kind of people. And it's kind of a funky take on that. I don't know why. It's kind of funny, even though it's about a lawyer and Hunter S. Thompson going to Las Vegas and doing a lot of weird drugs, but I don't know. It's kind of fun. And then what else would I recommend? Life-changing book. Well, it's just, I don't know. This is so obvious, but I don't know. Read The Black Swan or read. Well, those are always my favorite nonfiction ones, or Fooled by Randomness or something. I think those are always good for people to read. So,
well, you know what? Since you happen to be a fan of history, I'm sure you read this, but if you haven't, I always recommend this. It's called The Guns of August by Barbara Tuchman.
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Yeah, I have The Guns of August on my Kindle, and I haven't had a chance to read it, but I guess that's pretty much like the most well-known history book on World War I, I guess. So,
yes. And she does a fantastic job. I could not put the book down for fans out there who just like, and you start to sort of realize the gears of war and how they sort of, gain traction and sort of the pettiness of the people in charge. And you realize they're just human beings, but they have a scale at their disposal that the likes of which we wouldn't have. And so you start to see it like, oh my God, this is that much worse than, war is bad, but you never really realize how petty and childish the origins of it are, right? Until you read these books and you're like, man, it's just everybody trying to put themselves superior to everybody else, right?
She actually wrote a book that I have read before that was sort of on the origins, leading up to World War I. And she talks a lot about like the anarchist movement around Europe and stuff. And there were some various assassinations going along. And I think she tries to sort of trace that sort of anxiety back to, the assassination with Franz Ferdinand and all that other stuff. But they were kind of like all over Europe and they were even in the U.S. too. Like the Chicago accident had a big thing called this Haymarket thing where there was like, I don't know if there was a bombing here or something, and then it was sort of some really, really pissed off people, I think, at the government, and these movements were kind of spreading, I think, in the West, and she kind of talks about a little bit about that, and then I think that's from there is when she gets into the Guns of August. So I don't know. That's just a little what I remember offhand.
Right. Fair enough. Well, we just want to thank you, James, for coming on and sharing with us your perspective, and we hope you had as much fun as we did.
I had a very good time. I really thank you for having me on.
We hope you enjoyed this episode as much as we have. The truth is, any conversation worthy of having will inherently be a risky one.
Thank you for listening. Stay anti-fragile and carry on the ancient tradition and your own unique way of saying what only you can say and doing what only you can do. Abiding by Milton's words, this is Ember Sadat and Ace Deliri signing off, wishing you the very best of worthy and risky conversations.